The dust of Dry Hollow had seen many strange sights, but none stranger than the woman in white. Every Sunday, as the church bell tolled and the town gathered on Main Street, Evelyn Hart would appear. Her dress, once bright, once stitched with promise, dragged heavy across the dirt, its hem stained brown and gray with years of walking. The lace had yellowed, the veil frayed like old parchment, but still she wore it. Children whispered and pointed. Men tipped their hats with mocking smiles. Women shook their heads, muttering words like pitiful, mad, or worse, cursed. "Here she comes again," someone would sneer. "The bride with no groom." They laughed as if the sight was entertainment, as if her pain was a parade. The dress, they said, was her shackle, a reminder of the man who never showed, of a wedding that never was. And Evelyn, she carried it without flinch, her back straight, her eyes set not on them, but far beyond, as if she walked a road no one else could see. For 20 years she had done this, 20 years of Sundays, 20 years of whispers, giggles, and cruel jokes whispered loud enough for her to hear. The dress had become her legend, and legends were easier to mock than to understand. But what no one knew, what no one dared to ask, was why she wore it still. Because beneath the ridicule, there was something more. Something the town of Dry Hollow had never bothered to see. On this night, however, the story would turn. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky with bruised purples and reds. The church bell had long gone silent. The streets were empty, save for lanterns flickering in the windows. Evelyn walked as she always did, her white dress ghost-like in the half-light, her hands folded calmly at her waist. And then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, deliberate. A stranger rode in from the north, his silhouette cutting sharp against the moon. He did not pass her by. He stopped, watched, dismounted. No jeer, no smirk, no whisper. Just silence. And in his hand, dust-caked, bound with fraying twine, he carried something that shimmered faintly under the lantern light. A bundle of letters. Letters written by hands now long gone. Letters Evelyn herself had once carried, once posted, once prayed over. He held them as if they were sacred, as if they were proof of something greater than the mockery she had endured. And with that single act, standing there with the night at his back and the letters pressed to his chest, the town's cruel laughter began to die in the dust. Because for the first time in 20 years, someone had come for the bride of Dry Hollow. Every town carries its own rhythm. Dry Hollow's rhythm was dust, sweat, and Sunday bells. And every Sunday, without fail, Evelyn Hart walked the same path. Down from her weathered porch, across the crooked boardwalk, through the center of Main Street until she reached the church steps. Always in white. Not the bright white of fresh linen, but the faded, tired white of fabric that had known too many summers. The gown sagged where it had once clung, seams loose, hem heavy with years of grit. Its veil fluttered in the breeze like the wing of a dying bird. Children waited for her like they waited for the circus. "Look, it's the ghost bride," one boy shouted, running ahead to mimic her solemn walk. The others laughed, tossing pebbles that caught in her skirts. The men at the saloon leaned against the rail, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, smirking as she passed. 20 years late to her own wedding," one drawled. "She's waiting for a groom buried out in Boot Hill," another answered, and they all roared. The women weren't kinder, only quieter. They hid their judgment behind folded fans and polite murmurs. Poor Evelyn, so pitiful, so stubborn. Some even crossed themselves as if her persistence were a sin. But Evelyn kept walking, her chin high, her steps even. She did not hurry, she did not flinch. The dress dragged, the veil shifted, but she never once turned to acknowledge the noise that followed her. Because this walk was not for them. It had never been for them. 20 years ago, when the church bells rang for her wedding, the groom had not come. They said he rode east chasing gold, or west chasing another woman. No one knew. What everyone knew was that Evelyn Hart stood at the altar in her gown, waiting, while the whispers began. When the whispers turned to laughter, she walked out, still in white, and she never stopped. Each Sunday, she wore the dress. Each Sunday, she sat in the same pew. Each Sunday, she left alone. The town decided it was madness. They built jokes around it, told travelers the tale of Dry Hollow's ghost bride. But to Evelyn, it was a vow. A thread she refused to cut, though the years gnawed at it like moths. She never explained why, never gave them the satisfaction of confession. If the town demanded a fool, then she would be their fool, until truth itself rose to silence them. On the 20th year, that truth arrived. Not with a ring, not with roses, but with hoofbeats on a silver night, and letters that carried the weight of every Sunday she had endured. And when the stranger's shadow touched the town's dust, for the first time, the people of Dry Hollow felt their laughter falter. Because maybe, just maybe, the bride they mocked had been keeping a secret all along. Dry Hollow slept early. By 9, lamps dimmed. By 10, only the saloon lights flickered. Midnight was a time for coyotes and wind, not men. That's why the sound of hoofbeats woke the dogs first, then the drunks, then the town itself. Slow, steady. One rider. He came down from the ridge like a shadow cut out of moonlight, horse dark, hat pulled low. The streets emptied at that hour, yet curtains shifted as people peeked. They'd seen riders pass through before, gunslingers, drifters, men running from the law. But this one moved with a calm that unsettled more than a gallop ever could. He didn't head for the saloon, didn't seek the livery. He stopped in front of Evelyn Hart's house, the ghost bride. Even at that hour, she sat on her porch in the same dress, veil pushed back, a lantern at her side, as if waiting, as if she always knew waiting was her curse. The rider dismounted without a word. Dust clung to him, and on his saddle was a leather satchel bound in fraying twine. He didn't greet her, didn't mock, didn't bow, didn't offer charm. He just stood there holding the satchel as if it weighed more than gold. "Do you know me?" Evelyn asked at last, her voice calm but cracked with years of dust and silence. The man shook his head once. "No, but I knew them." He set the satchel at her feet. Letters spilled loose across the porch, their edges curled and stained by smoke, some marked with military seals, others with handwriting faded near to nothing. Evelyn froze. She knew those papers. She'd carried them once, smuggled them to soldiers, travelers, and lost boys who had no one else to write home. "They said you saved them," the stranger went on, voice low, as if the words weren't meant for the town's ears. "Fed them, hid them, buried some when no one else would. They said you were their only witness." The dress rustled as Evelyn rose, frail but unbent. Her hands hovered over the letters as if afraid they'd turn to dust. "And who are you?" she whispered. The stranger lifted his gaze, eyes like storm clouds fixed on her. The last one who promised to deliver their thanks. For a moment, the only sound was the night, the wind, the creak of the old porch, the steady breath of the horse. Then, as if summoned, lamps flickered alive across the street. Faces appeared at windows, shadows gathered by the saloon door. The town, always eager for spectacle, had awakened. And what they saw was not the fool in a dress, but a man in the dark, laying proof of a truth they'd mocked for 20 years. The stranger did not bow. He did not smile. He simply set his hat back on his head and said, "Tomorrow they'll hear the rest." And with that, he left the satchel at her feet and walked into the shadows, leaving Evelyn Hart standing alone, her wedding dress glowing ghost-like under the moon. But this time the town did not laugh. Morning came slow, spilling pale light across Dry Hollow. By the time the church bell rang, the satchel on Evelyn Hart's porch was no longer just hers. It had become the town's secret. Neighbors passed with baskets and buckets, their eyes straying to the bundle of letters as though afraid to touch, but too curious to ignore. Evelyn waited until the sun cleared the ridge. Then, with careful hands, she opened the satchel fully. The letters spilled across her lap like dry leaves, each one a fragment of a life once breathing. The first envelope was stained with sweat and powder burns. She broke the seal, and her lips moved soundlessly as she read, "Dear Ma, tell her I ain't scared no more. Tell her I had bread in my belly that night 'cause Miss Evelyn fed me when no one else would." Her breath caught. The letter wasn't addressed to her, but it spoke of her. A boy she had tended when he stumbled bleeding from the hills, too young to die alone, too far from home to be remembered. She had written his final words, carried them to a soldier's post, and prayed they would find his family. The next letter was shakier, written in a hand that trembled. She gave me water when my lips were cracked, called me son, though I was nothing to her. If you read this, know I didn't die forgotten. Evelyn pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closing. She remembered him too. The runaway with broken shoes. She had mended his feet as best she could. He had not lasted the winter. One by one she read them aloud, though no one had asked. Farmers lingered at fence posts, women paused with laundry baskets, children crouched in the dirt listening. Letter after letter, the same truth unfolded. Evelyn Hart, the woman mocked as the ghost bride, had been their refuge. While the town sneered, she had fed the starving. While the town jeered, she had buried the nameless. And the dress? The dress had not been madness. It was her vow. A promise stitched in white, to walk in mourning until every soul she carried was remembered. By midday, the stranger returned. He found her on the porch, dress glowing in the high sun. The letters spread like holy scripture before her. They thought me foolish, Evelyn whispered, voice hoarse. But these were my children. The stranger nodded, his jaw set tight. I told you last night. Those men wanted the world to know, and now the town does. Behind them, the crowd thickened. No one laughed, no one dared. For 20 years, Dry Hollow had chosen mockery over truth. But now, with every word spoken from the faded pages, Evelyn Hart was no longer the ghost they scorned. She was their witness. And in the silence that followed, the town understood that the joke had never been hers. It had always been theirs. By evening, Dry Hollow was restless. The letters had spread faster than wildfire on dry grass. What began as whispers on Evelyn's porch had turned into talk in the saloon, arguments in the general store, murmurs in the church pews. For 20 years, Evelyn Hart had been their laughter, their spectacle. Now, the truth pressed heavy on every lip, souring the taste of old jokes. The saloon filled with muttering voices. She made all that up, one man spat, slamming his glass on the counter. Ain't no proof them words are real. But his voice cracked with doubt. The bartender, polishing the same glass too long, didn't answer. He had seen the letters himself, seen Evelyn's hand tremble as she held them like relics. At the church, the pastor folded his hands, eyes downcast. A woman asked him, "Shouldn't we say something? She saved lives." But he only sighed, his voice hollow. It's not the church's place to undo laughter already sown. And the sheriff, old coat dusty, badge dulled, leaned against the post office wall, chewing his toothpick. When pressed, he shrugged. She ain't broken no law, but it ain't my job to mend a reputation neither. So the town turned away. Not with jeers this time, but with silence. A silence worse than laughter, because it admitted guilt but refused forgiveness. All except one. The widow blacksmith, arms strong and eyes sharper than her forge fire, found Evelyn that night. She stood on the porch where the letters still lay in neat piles. "You kept your promise," the widow said simply, voice carrying the weight of iron struck true. "And they mocked you for it. Let them choke on their shame." She lifted one of the letters, studied its faded ink. "Men write lies easy, but death don't. These words are real." Evelyn met her gaze. "They'll never see me different? Not truly?" The widow shook her head. "Maybe not. But truth don't need their permission." She reached into her apron, pulling a small tool, its edge ground fine. "I'll sharpen what you carry. Make it cut clean when the time comes." It wasn't just a tool. It was a promise of defense should the town, or anyone else, try to bind Evelyn again. From the shadows across the street, the stranger watched. He hadn't spoken since the night he'd delivered the letters, but his presence lingered like a sentinel. And when the saloon doors burst open, and the cattle baron strode out flanked by a lawyer waving a sheet of parchment high in the lamplight, the air thickened. "Contract of sale," he bellowed. Signed, sealed, and witnessed. Proof this woman was never more than property. And here's her mark to prove it. The lawyer unfurled the paper, and there, scrawled across the bottom in crude ink, was a name Evelyn knew too well. Her own, forged. The town that mocked her now stood frozen, and the battle for her truth had only just begun. By dawn, the news had spread through Dry Hollow like smoke on the wind. The cattle baron had papers. Papers that claimed Evelyn Hart was not a woman at all, but property. Men gathered in knots on the boardwalk, spitting tobacco and muttering. Contracts clear enough, one said. Signed her own name. Looks more like chicken scratch to me, another replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The women whispered over wash basins. The children, once cruel in their mimicry, now eyed Evelyn from a distance with something close to fear. Evelyn herself sat straight on her porch, the yellowed veil pushed back. The letters spread like shields across the boards. The contract, waved so proudly the night before, had not been brought to her, only shouted in her face. That, she thought, said everything. At noon, the stranger returned. He had been gone since the Baron's outburst, riding the ridge roads, silent as smoke. Now he strode to Evelyn's porch, dust on his boots, jaw tight with resolve. In his hand was not a gun, but one of the letters. You still have them? Evelyn asked quietly. He nodded. And more besides. He tapped the folded paper against his palm. Not every lie can bury a truth. That afternoon, while the town drowsed in heat, the clang of metal rang out. The widow blacksmith hammered, sparks flying. The stranger stood at her side, handing tools, steady and wordless. When the iron cooled, she pressed it into his hand. A chisel, she said, sharp enough to split stone, or lies. He carried it like a weapon as he and Evelyn walked into the town square at sundown. The cattle baron was waiting, his lawyer too, smug behind spectacles. And half the town lingered, drawn not by justice but by the promise of spectacle, just as they always had. The stranger climbed the steps of an old wagon and rang a dinner bell loud enough to wake the echoes in the canyon. You've laughed at her for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying clean. But now you'll listen. He held up one of the letters, the paper trembling in the evening breeze. These are the words of men who died with her name on their lips. Men she fed, men she buried, men who called her mother when no one else would. The Baron snorted. Children's tales. I've got law on my side. He waved the contract again. The stranger's eyes hardened. Then let's read it together. He beckoned Evelyn forward. She mounted the wagon, her dress glowing pale in the lamplight. Her hands shook as she took the parchment, but her voice did not falter. This is not my hand, she said firmly, holding up the false signature. And this is not my story. The crowd shifted. A murmur rose, doubt, sharp as spurs. And when the stranger raised the chisel high, striking the wagon rail so hard the sound split the square, silence fell like a hammer. Evelyn Hart was no longer the ghost bride of Dry Hollow. She was the woman whose truth had finally found its voice. That night, Dry Hollow held its breath. The square still smelled of dust and doubt, the echo of the chisel's strike clinging to the air. The cattle baron had stormed off, his lawyer trailing, but his threat lingered like smoke. Evelyn Hart returned to her porch alone. The stranger had faded back into shadow, the widow blacksmith into her forge. The townsfolk scattered to their homes, whispering in doorways. She sat with the letters spread before her, the dress heavy around her like chains. For 20 years, the gown had been her shield, her vow, her punishment. Now it was something else, a weight she no longer needed to carry. She rose slowly, her joints stiff, and went inside. From the cedar chest by her bed, she fetched a small tin box. Inside was a matchbook, the kind her father once carried in his waistcoat. She held it in her hands for a long moment before stepping back onto the porch. The town was quiet but not asleep. Curtains shifted. Eyes watched. They always had. Without a word, Evelyn lifted the hem of her gown. She tugged it over her shoulders, layer by layer, until at last she stood in her slip. The wedding dress pooled at her feet like a shed skin. For the first time in 20 years, her body was her own. She gathered the fabric, dragging it into the yard. Dust clung to the train, and the veil fluttered like a dying banner. She set it on a pile of kindling left from winter woodcutting. The letters she returned carefully to the porch. Safe. The match flared in her hand. The sulfur stung her nose. When she dropped it, the fire caught fast. The gown curled and blackened, seams splitting with tiny pops. The veil burned last, lifting in a ghostly shimmer before collapsing into ember. Children crept from their doorways, wide-eyed. Men stood stiff on porches, hands on belts. Women held their shawls tight, murmuring prayers. No one laughed. No one dared. Evelyn stood barefoot in the dirt, her face lit by flame. "This was never madness," she said, her voice strong, carrying to every ear. "This was memory, a promise you all chose to mock because truth was too heavy for you to bear." The dress collapsed into ash, glowing red then fading to gray. Evelyn bent, scooping a scrap of scorched lace from the pile. She tied it around her wrist like a ribbon, small but unbreakable. The crowd shifted, restless. Some bowed their heads, some turned away in shame. On the porch, the stranger appeared, silent as ever. His eyes met hers. She didn't need his words to know he understood. The ghost bride was gone. What remained was Evelyn Hart, unbound, unashamed, and ready for the fight that still waited beyond the ashes. And by dawn, Dry Hollow would have to decide if it was brave enough to follow her. Morning came soft, a pale wash of gold across Dry Hollow. The fire pit in Evelyn Hart's yard still smoldered, little curls of smoke rising where the dress had turned to ash. Children crept past on their way to fetch water, peeking at the charred circle, whispering, "The ghost bride's gone." But Evelyn stood on her porch, no veil, no silk, no lace, just a plain cotton dress, faded with years of wear. Her hair was braided simple, her hands folded over the stack of letters she guarded like holy scripture. The town stirred uneasily. For decades, they had known what to call her: crazy, cursed, the ghost bride. Now, stripped of the gown, she was something else, and they fumbled for words. At the general store, a boy asked his mother, "What do we call her now?" The woman didn't answer. But later that afternoon, when Evelyn passed with her basket of letters, she murmured, "Good day, Miss Hart," her voice softer than it had ever been. The sheriff, chewing his toothpick as always, tipped his hat. Not much, but more respect than he had ever offered before. It was the widow blacksmith who said it first, loud enough for the town to hear. Evelyn had brought her a letter to grind its seal flat, proof against the cattle baron's claim. The blacksmith studied her a long while, then set down her hammer. "You ain't no ghost bride," she declared. "You're Mother Hart." The name stuck. By sundown, children called it in the street. Mother Hart, tell us the stories." Women began to nod to her in passing, some with tears, some with shame. Men, slower in pride, muttered it under their breath, the words tasting like penance. And Evelyn herself? She did not flinch from the name. For the first time, she wore it like armor, stronger than any gown could have been. But the cattle baron did not fade into silence. His lawyer spread word that the contract still stood, forged or not, and that Evelyn Hart, Mother Hart, would face repossession before the month was out. The stranger stayed close. Silent as ever, he rode the ridge roads at dusk, eyes always scanning. And each night, when Evelyn stacked the letters in neat piles by the window, he was there in the shadows, a sentinel no one dared question. Dry Hollow felt the change. Their ghost had burned away with the dress. What remained was something living, something rooted. And roots, once planted, are hard to pull free. The town had given her mockery for 20 years. Now, unwillingly, they had given her a new name. And with it came a truth they could no longer laugh away. Evelyn Hart had become the very thing they denied her all along. Indispensable. The moon rose pale over Dry Hollow, silvering the rooftops, painting the dust roads in quiet light. Evelyn Hart sat on her porch, the stack of letters beside her, the scrap of lace tied around her wrist. For once she did not feel the eyes of the town upon her. They were there, behind curtains and shutters, but they no longer mocked. The stranger stepped from the shadows as he always did, his boots soft against the dirt. He paused at the edge of the porch, hat in hand, waiting. Evelyn looked up, her tired eyes steady. "You've carried this longer than anyone should," he said at last, his voice low but sure. Evelyn gave a small, rueful smile. "Some promises don't keep you alive. They keep you honest." He nodded, as if he understood more than the words. From his coat, he pulled a single folded page, the last of the letters. He placed it on the table between them. Evelyn's fingers hovered, then opened it. It was written in a shaky hand. "She called me daughter when my own mother would not. If you find her, tell her she gave me back my name." Evelyn pressed the paper to her chest. A tear slid down her cheek, but it was not sorrow. It was release. "All these years," she whispered, "they thought the dress was my madness. But it was my vow. For every soul forgotten, I would stand in white until memory outweighed mockery." The stranger's eyes softened. "And now?" Evelyn looked to the smoldering pit where ashes still clung to the earth. "Now they remember. My vow is kept." For a moment, silence stretched between them, the kind not empty but whole, the kind she had come to recognize as sacred. The stranger set his hat back on his head. "They'll still come for you," he said quietly. "The Baron, the law, the lies. They don't forgive truth easy." Evelyn's hand rested on the lace ribbon at her wrist. "Then let them come. I have nothing left to hide, nothing left to burn." From the shadows, the widow blacksmith emerged, arms folded. "Not nothing," she said firmly. "You've got a town that owes you, and me with a chisel sharp enough to split their chains." Others lingered too, faces from doorways, figures in lamplight. Neighbors who had once sneered now stood uncertain but present, watching, listening. Evelyn rose to her feet. She faced them all, the stranger at her side. Her voice carried steady across the square. "I was mocked for 20 years, called ghost, cursed, mad. But I was never the ghost. I was the vow. And tonight, I am done being mocked." The silence that followed was not cruel, not cowardly. It was reverent. And in that silence, the stranger touched the brim of his hat, bowing once. A silent vow of his own, that she would not face the coming storm alone. The town had laughed at a bride. Now they stood before a matriarch. And Evelyn Hart, Mother Hart, stood unbroken,